It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this session on education and the human person in the Jesuit tradition. My name is José Casanova. I'm a professor of sociology at Georgetown University and a fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And me and my colleague, Professor Thomas Banchoff, who is the founding member or president, or director of the Berkley Center, are organizing a project on the Jesuits and globalization. So we've gathered together a group of scholars. We are spending 2 days here at Campion Hall discussing Jesuit education and Ignatian spirituality and the formation of the human person. This is the second symposium. We had a first symposium last spring at Georgetown University on Jesuit global mission, intercultural encounters, and interreligious dialogue. And we'll have a third symposium on universal common good, peace, and social justice. And then we'll have a final conference at the Gregorian, at the 200th anniversary of the restoration of the Society of Jesus. The idea of the project is to, on the one hand, reflect upon the history, the contributions of the Jesuits in the 16th, 17th century after their establishment as the kind of pioneers in the early modern phase of globalization, and look at this thing we call today globalization through the prism of the Jesuits, and look at the Jesuits through the prism of globalization. And in this process also to help us reflect and think about our contemporary situation and the contemporary possible role of the Society of Jesus to contemporary global process. And today we are going to discuss particularly this topic of Jesuit education, which became the premier ministry of the Jesuits as a teaching order. We are going to have 3 panelists. They'll introduce themselves. They are going to have 5 minutes, 5 plus a few minutes, to basically give introductory remarks. Then perhaps we may have just a brief conversation, and then we'll open up the floor for conversation among all of us. So please, Tom.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you all for coming, and a special thank you to Brendan Callahan and his team here at Campion Hall for welcoming this group. It's a wonderful place to work and spend some time in the community, and we're delighted to be here. As Jose said, this is part of a wider research group. We've got about 15 scholars from around the world looking at different aspects of this issue of the Jesuits and globalization more broadly. Most of them are here today. We've had some interesting closed sessions, and we're delighted to share some of our reflections now with the wider group here at Campion Hall. Just a word of introduction about myself. Jose mentioned I'm director of the Center on Religion and World Affairs at Georgetown University. I'm a political scientist. I've been at Georgetown for 20 years now. And recently I was named the Vice President for Global Engagement at the university. So I approach these issues as a scholar of globalization, a political scientist, but also as a practitioner. And I thought in my comments it might be useful to share some ideas about this intersection of the human person, globalization, and the Jesuits as it relates to some of the challenges we're facing in higher education today, as a way of spurring conversation. So the overall context is this process of globalization. We don't have to make the case that globalization really matters anymore. There's a lot of theoretical literature about it. What's interesting about this project, among other things, is that we're juxtaposing kind of early modern era of globalization, if you will, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, with the current era, and exploring what's different, what's similar, how an order of the Catholic Church that emerged in that first era and was very global within a generation or two approached globalization at that time, and whether we can learn something from that approach and the way it's evolved over the centuries as we think about globalization, not just in terms of states and markets and consumers and citizens, but as a kind of intercultural encounter, even today. So that relates to Jose's point about what the Jesuits can teach us about globalization. Now, to bring it down to the context of higher education, today, in this current phase, what we're seeing is the emergence of a global, or a more global, have to be careful, higher education sector, marked by increasing competition for resources and for the best students and faculty. And what's happening in this process is a lot of pressure in the direction of vocational or pre-professional education, a lot of pressure in the direction of research in the natural and applied sciences as opposed to the humanities. And so an institution like Georgetown, the first Jesuit university in the United States, founded in 1789, as it thinks about its own role, has to compete in this world of pressures, has to offer products that will sell, whether it's to students or visiting faculty, or in our efforts to gain funding from granting agencies. But we're also in a process of reflection about our own identity as a Catholic and Jesuit institution and what it means for our educational enterprise. And I'll just share a couple thoughts with you about how we see increasingly the liberal arts tradition in this wider historical context as something we need to rethink and reimagine in an intercultural way, in dialogue with other traditions. And we have in St. Ignatius and his spiritual exercises a kind of starting point, a kind of philosophical anthropology that one can draw on. So if one were to distill, and this is just for the purposes of discussion, different dimensions of this liberal education tradition and its particular articulation in the Jesuit tradition, there's an emphasis at the outset on care for the whole person, cura personalis, that I think is expressed in an emphasis on self-reflection and meeting the student in his or her interior life, the role of imagination. It's reflected in an emphasis on ethical judgment and giving students the resources they need to think reflectively and ethically about their role in the wider world. And alongside self-reflection and ethical judgment, we might put a third element. One could debate whether this is a more modern addition or whether it was there from the outset. The idea of engaging difference. The idea that as you move out into the world, and there's a very worldly spirituality that the Jesuits have developed, you encounter other human beings and learn from them, engage with them in dialogue. That there's some way now in this global moment we're in to rethink those three elements of a traditional liberal education at a time when, in the context of this current phase of globalization, identities are being unsettled, individuals find themselves delinked from traditional, more fixed identities, whether it's family or community or nation. So the idea of self-reflection and positioning oneself has taken on increasing importance. In an era when the ethical issues that we face are being defined more and more at the transnational or even international or global level. We talked today about refugees and migration, and you'll hear more from Peter about that, whether it's global health, issues of human rights. We need to prepare our students to go out and to develop a kind of ethical lens that takes them well beyond their traditional national or individual or community frames in a more global direction. And of course, one really doesn't have to make the argument, maybe one still does, that engaging difference, that intercultural dialogue is becoming more and more important. And I'm talking here not just about learning about the other, and this is a particularly sensitive topic in the United States. As the global balance of power shifts, and here I'm speaking as a political science, someone with a political science background, I suppose, as China and India, the Muslim world to some extent, gain an economic and political power, any effort to rethink global liberal education has to be an effort, or should be an effort among equals, and has to be lived out of the Western tradition that the Jesuits emerge out of, but in real dialogue with other traditions. And one of the principles of this project is that there's roots of that approach, evidence of that sensibility, a more intercultural sensibility, even going back to the 16th and 17th centuries. We had and I'll finish on this, a really rich debate and discussion about whether that history is being idealized. It has its darker sides, but some of us came to the conclusion that as long as we acknowledge those darker sides, we can go back and plumb that history and look for elements of it that are inspiring and that are relevant. And certainly in certain Jesuit missions in certain times, I think of Matteo Ricci in China, for example, we do have a positive example of intercultural engagement based on a kind of mutual respect that should be part of the way we think about liberal education in the global era going forward. So those are just some initial reflections that I hope will spark discussion. Again, delighted to be here, and let me turn it over to Maria Clara.
Introduce yourself.
Sorry?
Yes.
Oh, you're not ready? Would you like Peter to go first? Yeah.
No, you told me you haven't been started.
Well, 1, 2, 3.
Okay. No, I thought I will.
Okay.
Okay. Excuse me. I'm not an English native speaker, so I apologize, but I will read a little bit of a paper I had, and not to penalize so much the language of Shakespeare.
Please introduce yourself, yeah.
I'm Maria Clara Bingemer. I'm a professor of theology in the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. And I suppose I'm here because I did my doctoral thesis about the Trinity in St. Ignatius. And then in 2006, I organized from my university, together with another Jesuit University of Brazil, a big event, an international event about Jesuits and globalization. Then Professor José Casanova invited me to be here, and I'm very happy. It's very enriching, the debate and what you heard yesterday and today. As our topic is education, I will focus on a particular case, a Jesuit who is the rector, the president of a university, and try to do something different. Ignatius of Loyola was a Jesuit priest, philosopher, theologian, who did an important work as professor and rector at the Universidad Centroamericana José Simeón Cañas, UCA, university in El Salvador, founded in 1965. His work was decisive for the shape UCA took in its first years of existence and the years to come. Loyola was also responsible for the development of formation programs for priests in the Jesuit Central American province. Loyola's academic work was an important contribution to liberation philosophy. He has many books, and he was also a strong supporter and contributor to liberation theology. According to him, the existence of people that are marginalized from society implies that history and practice have not delivered a wider range of possibilities for realization for every human being in the world. This situation has prevented these excluded people to realize their existence as human beings. Therefore, it is a situation that stands away from the fullness of humanity and the fullness of reality. But this situation can be changed. So Loyola intended to build a new theology and a new philosophy, which he called historical theology. By historical theology, he meant a way of making theology, to reflect about faith departing from the historical present, and to reflect about the historical present departing from faith. According to him, all theology is conditioned by its historical present. Historical theology intends to acquire conscience about its historical context and to incorporate it fully. The concept of locus theologicus is then very important to this theology. According to Loyola, salvation is accomplished historically, not just individually, but collectively. It is not just about liberation from evil, guilt, personal or social offenses, pain, disease, and fetishism. Those forms of liberation only start by liberation from unjust structures, like slavery, political domination, psychological and social oppression. In his discourse of 1982 at the University of Santa Clara, California, Loyola expressed very eloquently his conviction in favor of the promotion of justice in educational apostolate. And I quote, "A Christian university has to take into account the preference of the gospel for the poor. That doesn't mean that the poorest must be those who enter to do studies at the university, neither that the university must give up cultivating all that academical excellence which is needed to solve real problems that affect its social contexts. It means, yes, that the university must incarnate itself among the poor intellectually, to be science of those who don't have voice, intellectual support for those who, in their same reality, have the truth and reason, in spite of sometimes as spoliation, but who don't count with academical reasons that justify and legitimate their truth and their reason, end of quote. One of the most interesting proposals of Irecuria to this counter direction of history is to build a civilization of poverty. It has to do with consumerism, dictatorship, and wealth civilization. To avoid misunderstandings, he explains his own terms. I quote, "The civilization of poverty is so called by counterposition to the civilization of richness, and not because it pretends the universal pauperization as a life ideal. What we want to underline here is the dialectical relationship richness-poverty in itself. In a world configured sinfully by the dynamism capital-richness, it is necessary to raise a different dynamism which overcomes it salvifically." The case of Irecuria is exemplifying something that we think is important for the global action of the Society of Jesus in today's world. It's not the only one, perhaps not the best one, but it is certainly the work of a man, a Jesuit, inspired by the spiritual exercises, who understood his role as president of a university, not only as a headhunter of brains or a career administrator, but as a responsible to make this institution an instrument of inclusion and of justice. The thought produced at the UCA had, in Irecuria's understanding, to benefit those who were excluded of the benefits of progress and civilization, economically, culturally, ethically, aesthetically, and with their lives constantly threatened by violence, which is fruit of injustice. This project of inclusion would benefit not only the UCA, not only El Salvador, but the whole world. It would really help the kingdom of God to make consistent steps forward. According to him, there are two aspects to every university. The most evident one is that it deals with culture, or, in other words, knowledge and the use of intellect. The second, and not so evident, is that it must be concerned with the social reality, precisely because a university is inescapably a social force. It must transform and enlighten the society in which it lives. To finalize, I would like to quote a text from Noam Chomsky. It is, Noam Chomsky was always very impressed and very much touched by the martyrdom of the whole Jesuit community in El Salvador in '89. 24 years after, when commemorating the 24th anniversary of the killing of the whole Jesuit community, he addressed some words to Stefan Kubiak. And those words are very pertinent, I think. And I quote, "Closer to the explanation is our observation that they, Eastern European dissidents, were supported by the US and the Vatican, unlike dissidents elsewhere who were supported by no one with any power or influence. But it is a great understatement. They, Eastern Europe dissidents, were given massive support and attention by the entire Western world, quite unprecedented support, vastly greater than the support given to people within Western domains, who were suffering far worse oppression and were defending freedom and justice with far greater courage. The disparity is so extraordinary that the very word dissident in Western languages refers to East Europeans. No one, except those few who have extricated themselves from the Western propaganda system, even uses the word dissident for people like the Central American Jesuit intellectuals who were assassinated in November 1989 by elite forces armed and trained by the US. And while every word of East European dissidents is widely publicized, hailed, and treasured, try to find even a reference to the very important and courageous writings of Father Irecuria and his associates, or other Central American dissidents who had to flee from slaughter or were simply tortured and killed by US-run force. So the Global South is still not included in the globe. This is surely a big challenge for the Society of Jesus today, that Irecuria faced from the place where he was as president of the UCA. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Peter?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for giving me the chance to say a few words in this distinguished hall, Campion Hall. I was 30 years ago a student of English language here. Forgive me if my Oxford accent has deteriorated a bit. So it's a pleasure to be here. I joined from here at that time in 1984. I set out to Zimbabwe, and that having marks a little bit my life as a Jesuit. Having joined a global organization, I had the chance of studying in different places and continents. I did philosophy in Germany, then theology in Hekima in Nairobi after my time in Zimbabwe as scholastic, and then 2 years in Brazil, in Belo Horizonte. And of course it forms one's mindset and so on. So I like the topic a lot. I'd like to comment, and at present, to complete my CV, at present I am working with the Jesuit Refugee Service as International Director since 6 years. I'd like to comment a few words on globalization, Jesuits, the Jesuit Refugee Service, and higher education, and try to knit that a little bit together. First, globalization, one can look at that from many different angles. It's definitely a long process, hasn't started 20 years ago. There are different phases, intensities, but sometimes also reverse processes. One can look at it on the political, on the economic aspects, and recently it's more looked just on the economic aspect. But a very important aspect of globalization is human mobility. People move all the time. And they moved a lot also in the last 400 years. Okay, there was in the colonial period, the Spain, Portugal expanding, reaching out to new continents, that movement. And then in the after suppression, that enormous movement of migrants, European migrants, to the New Worlds, followed by the Jesuits, accompanied. So and also nowadays, the movement of people, voluntarily and involuntarily forced displacement. So that's important to have that in mind. Second aspect of globalization I'd like to highlight is the movement of ideas. Ideas travel throughout human history. One can trace that also. And knowledge travels. And of course, in the recent centuries, education is an instrument of sharing knowledge, bringing different knowledge to other places, exchanging. So knowledge, and with that, education is a very important factor of globalization, changing ideas and so on. And I would even say that, when one takes Teilhard de Chardin, that experience or that vision, and that's what we experience nowadays even more, like the atmosphere, a knowledge sphere is growing, ever getting more intensive around the globe, and there's some truth in that. In this big development and process of humanity, this kind of globalization, of course the question is, where's the place of the Jesuits? And I'd like to highlight, yes, the Society of Jesus has been a very mobile global body from its very beginning. It's always amazing when you think in the first 10 years they've been in all the 4 continents, in Brazil, in Banza Congo, in Angola. I worked there once as regional director in Southern Africa and in India and so on. So it's fascinating, that mobility over the centuries of the Society of Jesus. And then, of course, as I said, moving with the settlers, moving with the migrants to the New Worlds, Australia, the Austrian Jesuits, and so on, the United States and South America. So being part of that process, also describing that marks the Jesuit history. And then, in being part of that process of mobile humanity, they carried the education along, the knowledge. Some of the Nazis to Europe, let's call it a standardized formula of education for all, whoever went into school, studied that, and built a global network of education and sharing knowledge. But also then communication was very crucial from the early on, which was also said this morning, how important communication was and is for the Jesuits and for the process of globalization. At that time, the rules of letter writing of St. Ignatius, communicating all what they discovered and saw in the new worlds and new cultures and nature and so on, all the information which was exchanged at that time in the first phase of the society formed part of this growing network and global kind of knowledge exchange and sphere. So education, again, very important in this process for the Society of Jesus. More recent, coming to the last 30 years, there's the experience of a global drama, the boat people from Cambodia, Vietnam, in Asia, a global crisis, one can say so, of a global dimension, at least in the media and the kind of in the mindset of all people around the globe, marked also Father Arupe, and to call on the Society of Jesus to give together as an international global body a global response. So that's very important, acting as one body in a major issue of humanity. So that's how the JRS was formed, and of course I might connect now forced human mobility, forced displacement, refugees, a very specific group which is in the global community, has a special kind of special place in that they're not wanted, that they have lost their protection in their home countries, and nowadays there are also many stateless and so on. The refugees are in the human community in a very special kind of situation. And here, if I highlight one aspect of the work of the Jesuit Refugee Service over the last 30 years, first of all, by need, we started to do education. Other organizations are better in distributing food and all that. What we know better by our tradition, also as a work of the collaboration of the Catholic Church, is education. But even more, the needs of the refugees, because you don't need just bread alone to live, the Bible says, but people need ideas which give hope. And Kaltenbach always said, education gives hope. And that's why we do that. It's a very spiritual work. It gives hope. It nourishes hope, gives a perspective, gives new thinking. And so JRS became an organization known in the UN world very much as one of the very reliable education organizations. We have last year's report says 220,000 young people in education activities, from kindergarten to primary school, most of them in primary school, and a couple of thousand in secondary school. But we have started now the university education. So we offer a whole range in Dzaleka camp in Malawi, because that's a protracted situation. People are there since 1994-5, after the Rwanda crisis. Of course, new people came, others left, but quite a lot of the young people have been born there. So they went to our kindergarten, went to the primary school, secondary school. Now some of them who have finished secondary school last year have joined our higher education program. And that is what I'd like to talk a bit about. There was this idea born from a group of Jesuit universities in the United States. Can we not do something together for the poor? So they formed that group, that platform, Jesuit Commons. Like the commons place, the marketplace, sharing resources. It's really, the idea is not in competing with one another for students, but sharing knowledge, resources, time to help people who have no access to higher education. So Jesuit Commons formed that group, and they approached JRS as a partner, saying, you know, you work in the refugee world, and saying, yeah, we know refugees have a lot of needs and so on, and we became now not just an implementing partner, but the partner on the ground. So you have a partnership of a network of universities, and that's growing. We have faculties, course donations from more than half of the US universities, already
Jesuit
universities, and even some non-Jesuit universities come in. Then in India with Calcutta Xavier College, in Europe we have started some contacts and explore the different ways of how they can chip in. So far it's all voluntary, because we want to serve the poor together, and I think that's a very important aspect, that desire to serve a marginalized group. That's why we gave that project the name Jesuit Commons, Higher Education at the Margins. So for refugees or other marginalized groups or countries in great difficulties. So that's that side. And the third component is technology. And that's a very important aspect in nowadays. Things are changing. We talked today, in one of the papers was mentioned how Gutenberg, the printing press, made it possible for the Jesuits to carry first along the printing press along, as we carry the computer now along, really to duplicate knowledge and make it accessible. You could carry knowledge all over the world in books. And the book, obviously, and the faculties might correct me, has shaped the learning. This is where we are. In a refugee camp, I cannot bring this library to a refugee camp. I can put a computer there, the internet, and then link in into Regis University, Denver. That is, at the moment, the awarding university for our diploma students. And the content is liberal arts. I didn't know much about liberal arts before, because it's a US course, a name for that, but I learned about it, about Ignatian pedagogy and how to deliver it, the content, which also includes, leadership training, philosophy, logic, learning about other religions, but also pedagogy, education, and business. And it's a 3-year course, 45 credits. At that point, we had the first 50 graduates last month, and so a faculty, the academic vice president of Regis University, came and visited the Regis campus in Salika, in Malawi, and in Kakuma, meeting their students who are regular Regis students. But of course, Georgetown, other universities, Gonzaga, they all contribute to that, and outside of the US, ever more growing number. So liberal arts, why do we have liberal arts? Because we want to form leaders. It's not just knowledge delivery. At the beginning, when the refugees sign up, what do you want to study? Some astronautics, some that. We cannot deliver that at this point of time. Maybe in 10, 20 years. But at this point of time, what is most important is people come from destroyed countries, from messed up situations, mainly because of bad leadership and injustice, disregard for human dignity, for human rights. They are the victims of this kind of situations of wars in Congo, Rwanda, 20 years ago, and Syria, and so on. In Afghanistan, they want something different. That's a very special group. They want something different. And their reflection adds to the content of that course, of the delivery, because they think actively. They have suffered, and that's a different quality of reflection in the studies. That's what the faculties say who deal with the students. So we deliver these courses online with faculties sitting in the US, getting up in the morning at 4 o'clock in order to talk with the students in Spokane, to talk with the students in Kakuma, who are just at 4 or 5 o'clock, because at 6 o'clock we have to shut down. In the evenings they cannot work in the center for security reasons. That is also what it means, global learning across timelines. It's exciting. So technology is a key, and that makes it possible. And we need to be aware, and I come back now, sorry, I jump sometimes, and then associative thinking to Gutenberg. What at that time the book was, is now the online, the internet, and accessibility to all that knowledge through the computer. And that will change dramatically the landscape of education. The little I understand, that's what they talk all the time, Georgetown and so on. We don't know where it goes, but we need to be in that, and that's what we try to do. It's not just higher education for refugees. It's a pilot to try out how can it work, bringing universities together via online to deliver courses with a mixed model, with a community of learners, with tutors, but having the faculty on the other side, wherever in the world. We have a model so far now which is transferable. We can scale it up and sustain it. Of course, like many institutions, like also Georgetown, getting donors who help a big institution. And some fees. We roll it out now, not just in Kenya, Malawi, and Jordan, but to expand now. We have started in Thailand at the border. In Myanmar, we are exploring now with Gonzaga, the Institute for English Language. Afghanistan, we have started in Herat with the English course for the 50 young men, 50 young women. Sri Lanka and Chad, we are doing this. So by 2018, we want to have trained in 10 countries more than 1,000 diploma students. And besides that, I didn't mention that they had certificate courses, just 3 to 6 months, 11,000, which are very much skills needed in the camp situation. So it's a pilot project. It's something new which could show the way it's possible to link all these 180 universities of the Society of Jesus to work together with a very clear vision, a goal to serve people. And I do believe what also the discussion today showed, for me, more as a practitioner, not so much as a scholar, but it's good to hear all that from the history, that what we try to do is very much in line with the Society of Jesus, with the best praxis, and very much in line what can be the specific contribution of the Society of Jesus and learning institutions of the Society of Jesus in very special situations of many people who suffer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. I think I was not able to restrain them to 5 minutes.
Sorry.
I'm going to, no,
Yeah,
it was a
that's
fascinating, in every respect, presentation, the 3 presentations. I'm going to open up the floor for conversation, comments, discussion, questions, please. Please introduce yourselves as you bring some questions. Please.
My name is Peter. I'm doing an MST in theology here. I have a question. There's a lot of pushback against the massively online courses, with studies showing that they're not as effective as people had hoped. What kind of evaluation do you have to see the effectiveness of the training in the refugee camp?
We have this discussion of the MOOCs, the massive online courses, and we opt for a different model. I call it a mixed model. The mixed model with the best tradition of the Society of Jesus, of education. You have a community of learners, you have a tutor, but you use the knowledge which can come from anywhere or from the institutions delivered as course. And there is a way of also to use one day the MOOCs which Georgetown produces, but if they donate it, then we can, another institute or Georgetown say, yes, we award this student. And that's where the difference is. We are not fighting for market shares. We try to serve the poor and even give them the recognition. You have done that course, you have understood, we give you that credit, which they then can transfer on whatever global level where they go one day.
Can you say something too, Peter, about the virtual dialogues you have across the camps? Because that's a way of using these technologies in a more dialogical fashion. Yeah.
And that's what we started now last year with the third group, the intake, or the group which graduated the third year, to create the virtual classroom, so that a faculty, you need for one delivery of one course of 2 months, that's in units, 3 professors for 30 students. We deliver that at the same time in the 3 camps, in the 3 situations. But we put groups together that a professor has 10 people, 1 faculty, and some come from Dzaleka camp from Congo, Burundi, in Kakuma camp from Somalia, and some from Syria or Iraq in Jordan. And they study together, and they discover together their concepts, different readings, different angles of understanding texts, and that's very enriching for the students and for the faculty accompanying them. And that will happen ever more, the virtual classroom. But it is also important to have a community of learners together, because we want to have a kind of a momentum of people in a camp who have grown together to make a change in a camp, in the situation where they are now.
Any other question? I mean, while you are thinking of the questions, one of the interesting new developments has been, of course, or let's say, a repetition. I mean, the Jesuits started to a certain extent through the Ratio Studiorum, a model of a college that could travel around the world. And you had hundreds of Jesuit colleges. By the time of the suppression, of course, all of them disappeared. And since the Restoration, there has been a slow process of building Jesuit educational institutions around the world. Most of them work isolated from one another and without really joining forces. What has happened in the last probably 10, 15 years is, for the first time, this notion of a Jesuit commons, namely Jesuit institutions from Latin America, North America, Africa, Asia, beginning to develop communication, partly also coming from above. Father Nicholas, the Father General, has very much promoted the notion, we are de facto a global network, we should use the resources we have because there are really global needs that we have a particular obligation to address. And I think that this is really what is part of this. This is only one aspect of it. There are many other initiatives taken where you have, let's say, Jesuit universities, let's say in Montevideo, in Uruguay, in which the students, which usually have been elite students in a Jesuit university, part of the praxis or dia praxis, all of them have to do is commit themselves to education in, let's say, poor neighborhoods, in other parts of the city. And a way of, again, linking the idea of the obligation of the Jesuits to educate leaders, but leaders responsible to themselves become engaged in sharing and contributing to the common good. So I think this is something which has renewed and given, to a certain extent, new energy to what was a traditional Jesuit mission, but that now is really developing in new directions. Please, yes.
It's been fascinating listening about the spread through Jesuit universities of knowledge. But a distinctive thing in Jesuit education, in Ignatius's exercises, is let them discover for themselves, as the best way of teaching is enable people to discover for themselves. And my question is, how does that characteristic, how is that being emphasized in your present wonderful growth of instructing people?
Maybe I give an answer, which is an answer of one of our students, quoted that already this afternoon, being asked by the engineers of Microsoft who have helped us to develop and test with us the multiple point service. And then Hyatt said in Seattle, she was resettled, when she was asked, which course did you like most? And she said, logic and philosophy. You know, why that? Because we were asked, what do you think? And that a number of these comments have encouraged us to stick to this liberal arts concept, to enable people with, how to be asked and then how to, give their answers, and a bit in that direction. It's not really a knowledge delivery. It is really with texts and material that people reflect and are invited to reflect and share.
I would add that it's certainly very difficult at an institutional level to try to inculcate those habits of self-reflection and discernment. What we try to do at Georgetown, my colleague Randy Bass here, our Vice Provost for Education, is leading our efforts, is encourage the best practices, encourage the individual faculty who share that ethos of getting students to think critically for themselves, to discern for themselves, to kind of work on their own identities and question some of their inherited moral concepts. And we're really running against a culture more widely, where the kind of interiority that is celebrated in the exercises, the cultivation of interior freedom and discernment, doesn't have many touch points in our wider consumer society. So there are no institutional answers. And you have a wonderful opportunity because you're standing up a new institution inductively, and you're asking the students from the beginning what works and what doesn't work. So we can learn from that experiment, I think. Yeah. We're going to wait you out. Comments too.
Well, yes. Maybe among yourselves you would like to respond. Yes. Please introduce yourselves,
Yes.
please.
My name is Ali Rahman from Turkey. I'm visiting professor. My question is to Professor Peter.
Yeah. Okay.
Is it Peter?
Balleis, Peter Balleis, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
What about teaching other religions in dialogue process?
Yeah. That we had
What about my question?
in
A little.
Yeah, wait.
Yeah,
He would
that-
like
My
to.
question, are the teachers Christians or Jewish, or the teachers of other religions, representative of other religions? How to recognize the other religions while teaching?
Following the discussions of the academics in of Jesuit Commons Higher Education, in the last year they had a course. I think they didn't find somebody on Christian theology or whatever. They delivered a course on Asian religions, and students in Africa. Most of the students are in Africa. Quite a number of Somali students from the Islamic background. Others are Christian backgrounds, or just African traditional religion. They found it quite interesting to listen to that. I cannot answer you if the teacher, the faculties were now from that background of that religion. That I cannot answer. But the attempt is really to have a variety and of things. It's definitely not to how should I say, to make Christians out of the students. Absolutely not. But to make people think about these topics, because at times religion is also being used by politics and so on for conflict and division and so on. We need to deal with that issue and get a better understanding, mutual understanding. And that's obviously happening, what some students also commented, in the papers about the value of learning about other religions and philosophies.
Yes, please.
John Askinis, Georgetown 13, and now here at Oxford doing a master's. Just kind of follow on to that, to your response. One interesting and maybe important difference between Jesuit activities in the first globalization, Jesuit activities in contemporary globalization, is that, particularly for the first 200 years of their existence, the Jesuits were highly evangelistic. They were evangelistic in a very interesting way, in that they attempted to engage in a it wasn't sort of just pronouncement. They attempted to engage in a dialogue with the cultures in which they were inhabiting, but it was also distinctly a kind of missionary effort. And so that even in Jesuit education, there was an amount of Christian content, for lack of a better word, being delivered, being engaged in. And I wonder, what is the role of the content of Christian religion and Christian theology in the Jesuit education today? Is Christianity just an ethos, or is it also a logos in education?
Please.
I can give the example of our university. Every student in every course has to do 12 credits of to what we call religious culture. So the first 4 credits is about the human being and the religious phenomenon. So it's an open view of what is religion as one of the most ancient experience of humankind, and present a big horizon of every of the biggest traditions. Then the second 4 credits are Christianity in dialogue, and he can choose, the student can choose, in dialogue with modernity, in dialogue with other religions, in dialogue with social reality. Then the third is ethics. The Christian ethics is privileged, but there is ethics is presented in a global way. And the fourth would be professional ethics. Then it is turned to the specific career. And this last one can be replaced by service to poor communities, for instance, stadiums, and that's the way
And it's striking none of those 4 tracks is about Christian theology or Catholic belief per se. It's always in relationship with something. That's typical of Georgetown, but there's a variety of approaches, of course, across Jesuit institutions.
Yeah. We
But-
have a large community of Jewish students. We have many different religions.
But what you've pointed out is really, really what characterized our contemporary global moment, which of course was a recognition in Vatican II in Nostra Aetate, right? A new sign in which for the first time the church fathers address themselves to other religions as equals, and the need to recognize, not characterizing them either as false or as heretic or as schismatics or whatever. But so this new understanding of our global humanity as being, you could say, irremediably religiously pluralistic. And then what is then, when you are talking about the logos of Jesus and how can it be communicated? Probably more through praxis than through preaching, right? I think that this is part of the probably of even, or let's say the praxis itself probably is what then allows the possibility of the reflection and the conversation about the logos behind the praxis. So I think that, but probably this was something that was characteristic precisely of the Jesuit encounter also in the first time. They went probably with a very clear notion of this is the logos and we are going to communicate it. But it was probably their praxis and the way they did it that distinguished them from others. So yeah, that's interesting.
And Saint Francis gets quoted by Pope Francis now, several times already. Preach the gospel, if necessary, with words. Right. So this idea that praxis is the way of spreading the message, or an important way of spreading the message. It's not an accident that he's a Jesuit, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it is Jesus the logos, but this logos is the way, right? Yes. Please.
Dan Madigan from Georgetown. Maybe I could add something to that because my field is Muslim-Christian relations and Islamic studies. It also relates to the professor's question from before, because I used to teach in Rome at the Gregorian University, and we had an exchange agreement with the theology faculty, the divinity faculty of the University of Ankara, and so we had an exchange of professors every year, and they would come and teach something about Islam in the Gregorian, and for the years I was at the Gregorian, I would go to Ankara each year, and I would teach sometimes about Christianity, but also about Islam, which is my specialty, and they were interested to hear about my work in Quranic else does come into it. Yes, the praxis is extremely important, and the act of hospitality, which I think is the thing which is very important for Peter's work and so on. And generally, hospitality goes a long way, but I think a hospitality in which you say to your guest, well, you just sit over there and listen, is not much of a hospitality in the end. You eventually have to invite people into the conversation and take them seriously. So, and I think that's an aspect of where we're moving more. It's slow because I think there is still that sense among a lot of people that part of globalization is saying, well, there are just multiple truths and we shouldn't really be engaging one another over this, we just study one another at a distance, which makes interreligious engagement a bit like moments in a museum. So we show one another our treasures. You believe in love, we believe in love too. Nobody particularly but to move to the next stage with a sufficient trust and really awareness of one another's traditions to engage. I think that's something that's eventuating, principally because you've got a lot of Muslim students now who actually make a serious study of Christianity, which was not so much the case until relatively recently. And in Rome we had many Muslim students who came to study Christianity. So that's just.
Thank you.
One
Yes.
more in the back.
Please. And please identify yourself, please.
Yes. As it develops, globalization ultimately is going to be asking the question about identity. What is our identity? All this business of all coming together. And it raises great panic in people, this identity question. And it is the cause of great division. Ultimately, who are we? And in order to sort of change our outlook, our way of thinking, which has been going on for millennia, not just in the 21st century, it's going to take an enormous amount, and particularly of dealing with that fear. Somehow, with all this coming together, we're going to lose our identity. We're just going to be in an unidentifiable mass. And people are terrified of that. And it's the need to address this, because I've seen it not in traveling the world, partly a little bit of traveling in the world, but I've seen it in very strong religious groups. This terror about facing the ultimate question of identity. And want to cling on to it. And this is what I must cling on to. I identify myself in this way, and for this I will die. And it's got the seeds of violence are in there.
Of course.
I mean, after the Cold War in the 90s, still I think that's valid till today, almost all conflicts are about identity, ethnic identity, group. I have that a strong connotation of that. That's a reality. And it has something to do with that fear. Now, I might not give you an answer, but my answer to that is, I come from somewhere from a village in Bavaria. We have an oak tree, which is beautiful. I like that tree. And I always, somehow for me, it's an image. If you have deep roots, if you can reach out to the world. Into my family married a girl from Malaysia. She is Muslim. How does that go? You know, Catholic, Bavarian, traditional family, all go to church and so on. But because faith is serious, and we take it seriously, that we receive her well, and she loves with the beautiful children. there was not kind of imposition. What I did at the marriage, not marriage in the church, because it was difficult, not easy for her, because the family at home wasn't happy with that. Now I visit the family once in a while. When I go to Singapore, it's different. It's growing. There's a mutual understanding. I gave her a Quran, which I got once in Lahore, to read it and study a bit. Her and my nephew a Bible. They come from two different traditions. Keep your traditions and it will work. We don't know where it goes, but it will happen more and more. We need to learn how to deal with that. But I personally believe if you have a deep identity, you are not threatened by the other. The problem is when people are weakened in their identity, roll over, then it becomes a kind of a defense. And that's where in a number of countries, because globalization just rolled over them and didn't respect, and people feel insecure, and that creates that. I don't know if it helps, but
Thank you.
Bingemer from Brazil wants to say something.
No, I'd like to add something. No, I think it's a very important question about identity. But I think that all our efforts to dialogue with the difference of the other presupposes identity. You can dialogue only if you have an identity. To put everything together in the mixer, it's not dialogue. I think it's another thing. So I think it are important also personal identities, but also institutional identities. For instance, the Catholic University is an institution of Christian inspiration, but that doesn't mean that it's not a space of freedom where plurality can happen and dialogue, and that is very good. Mm-hmm. So I think it's not good to be so keen of the identity that the monotheistic religions were accused of, and with reason, to be religions of conquest, of violence. No, I think the identity is to open to the other and to receive from the other and give also. For instance, in Brazil, there is a tribe of indigenous who lives in the Prelazia, where Dom Pedro Casaldáliga, one of the most prophetic bishops we have, live. And there was a community of sisters of Foucault who went there 27 years ago. When they arrived, the indigenous had 2 children, and the third they killed, and the others too, because they thought they only could run away from the white with 2 children. Well, and there were many suicides. Now, 27 years after, there are not much conversions, nor baptism done, but the suicide stopped, and the killing of the 3rd children too. So that's the gospel. No, I think this.
Tom wants to add something.
You know, I think this problem of identity, we discussed this today a little bit. I think it's true, you can't really engage in dialogue unless you have some identity, some foundation, and you cultivate that and so on. But from the point of view of educational institutions, at the beginning of the 21st century, that's a tall order, at least in the United States, where students more and more, for example, in surveys are asked, what are you? Catholic, Jewish, Christian, agnostic, atheist. The group of none of the above, and I mean not including agnostic or atheist, the group of seekers, people who are self-consciously non-aligned, if you will, and looking and seeking has increased. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That's just the sort of sociological reality we're dealing with the oncoming generation. Has a lot to do with social media, I think, and integration of information and the unsettling of existing identities through globalization. But it means that dialogue can't simply be on a strong foundation of identity. We've got to rethink that.
David?
I would just add one thing that it seems to me that genuine interaction and dialogue with others from other traditions can be one means by which one's own identity becomes clearer.
That's true. Yeah.
I think a lot of people who have started studying another religion begin to discover more about their own tradition than they knew to begin with. and that this kind of interaction can be
Mm-hmm.
can not only be a threat to identity, but can be a clarification of identity in a very creative way.
And if I may add, obviously Bishop Francis, our Pope Francis, has insisted on the notion that truth is relational, right? Which means that it is not a dialogue between doctrines or between truths as much as a dialogue between persons. And I assume that the fundamental question here is precisely the recognition of persons as persons and the needs of persons more than the recognition already of either firm identities or firm doctrines. If there is something that characterizes our mobility, obviously today is that all of us are, to a certain extent. I mean, if I look around the room, I'm sure that there is a lot of mobility that has led all of us to have contacts with so many different identities and so many different traditions and persons. And I think that this is part of the global. Of course, it does exacerbate problem of boundaries and problem and fear of precisely mixing too much and losing one's identity. But I think that there is also something to be said about the enrichment that comes from adding identities rather than keeping one single identity, right? We are all many circles of many different identities. And I think that this should be expressed and articulated as one of the richness and the possibilities we have today in our global world.